They say that in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. They tell us that the soul is the currency of the warp, and that when we die, we are cast into the sea of souls to be devoured by the primordial annihilator. We understand the nature of corruption. We know the stench of Nurgle's rot and the blood madness of Khorne. These are horrors we can name. These are horrors we can kill. But what happens when death does not come from the immaterium? What happens when the grave itself is not a gateway to the warp, but a prison of ice? Reports from the civitas of Macragge speak of a new anathema, not a daemon born of emotion, but a king born of sorrow. The temperature drops, the Auspex scanners freeze, and the honored dead of Ultramar, the sons of Guilliman who fell defending the 500 worlds, they are rising, not to serve the ruinous powers, but to serve him. The wind did not merely blow, it screamed, a cacophony of tortured spirits tearing at the adamantium-reinforced weave of Sergeant Varys's thermal cloak. In the northern wastes of Macragge, the cold was a known enemy, a beast tamed by the fusion generators of the capital. But this was different. This was a predatory chill that bypassed the flak armor and gnawed directly at the marrow. Varys checked his Auspex for the third time in a minute, the green phosphor screen flickering and dying as the machine spirit within shivered into dormancy. "Keep interval," he barked over the vox bead, his voice sounding tinny and distant even to his own ears. Behind him, the 6 troopers of Squad Aetius were little more than shivering silhouettes against the blinding whiteout, their standard-issue lasguns clutched tight against chest plates rime-crusted with ice. They were patrolling the perimeter of Listening Post Omega 9, a sensor station that had gone silent 2 standard hours ago. The silence on the VoxNet was absolute, lacking even the static of atmospheric interference. It was a silence that felt heavy, pregnant with a malice Varys could not articulate, a silence that suggested the very air had been murdered. They breached the perimeter of the outpost, expecting the scorched earth of a Xenos raid or the chaotic graffiti of a heretic incursion. Instead, they found a mausoleum of pristine horror. The blast doors were not melted by melta-charges or battered by orc power claws. They stood wide open, the locking mechanisms shattered by a force that had frozen the metal until it became as brittle as glass. Varys signaled the advance, stepping into the comms bunker. Inside, the temperature dropped even further, defying all laws of thermodynamics. The station crew was still at their posts. The tech adept was fused to his cogitator array. His mechadendrites crystallized mid-typing. A guardsman stood by the heavy bolter emplacement, his face a mask of rictus terror, eyes wide and frozen open, staring at nothing. There was no blood, no signs of a firefight, just statues of flesh and ceramic, perfectly preserved in the instant of their death. Varys touched the barrel of the heavy bolter. It crumbled into dust at his fingertip. "Throne preserve us," whispered Trooper Kalen, his voice trembling. "It's not just cold, Sergeant. It's empty. It feels like the grave." The motion started not with a shout, but with the sound of cracking ice, a wet, snapping noise that echoed through the bunker. Varys spun around, leveling his lasgun. The frozen guardsman by the heavy bolter blinked. It was not the blinking of life returning, but the mechanical shuddering of a reanimated corpse. A witchlight, a piercing, freezing azure ignited deep within the dead man's sockets, replacing the milky white of the cataract-frozen eyes. "Contact!" Varys screamed, squeezing the trigger. The lasbolt struck the reanimated soldier in the chest, cauterizing the frozen flesh, but the creature did not flinch. It simply turned,
raising a combat knife with a speed that belied its rigorous state. Outside, the snow erupted. The ground beneath the squad's feet churned as hands, blue, gaunt, and strong as iron, punched up through the permafrost. These were not the shambling poxwalkers of Nurgle, leaking pus and moaning, mindless dirges. These dead moved with the disciplined, predatory silence of wolves. Trooper Kalen screamed as a frost-rimed blade, wielded by a corpse wearing the tattered remains of a PDF uniform, drove through his throat, instantly freezing the arterial spray into a red mist of ice crystals. Varys kicked the reanimated corpse away, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The squad was breaking. Lasfire lit up the blizzard in strobe flashes of red, illuminating the horror closing in on them. Dozens of figures were emerging from the whiteout. Dead PDF troopers, ancient warriors in rusted plate, creatures that looked like they had been dug up from the deepest strata of Macragge's history. But above the slaughter, a presence manifested that brought Varys to his knees. On the ridgeline overlooking the outpost, the storm clouds parted, seemingly commanded by a will stronger than nature. A silhouette stood there, massive and imposing, draped in jagged midnight blue plate that seemed to devour the ambient light. A ragged cloak of shadow billowed behind him. In his hand he held a runeblade of terrifying proportions, its surface etched with runes that hurt the eyes to look at. The figure did not shout a war cry, he simply pointed the blade down at the valley. A wave of psychic pressure, cold and crushing as the bottom of the ocean, washed over Varys. This was no daemon of the warp, this was a king. "Fall back! Sound the alarm!" Varys roared, realizing that survival was a theoretical impossibility. Only warning the chapter mattered now. He fumbled for the flare pistol at his belt, his fingers numb and useless blocks of meat. A reanimated horror lunged at him, his face a frozen mask of a man Varys had once played cards with in the mess hall. Varys smashed the butt of his lasgun into the thing's skull, shattering the frozen bone like porcelain. He ripped the flare pistol free and aimed it skyward, pulling the trigger. A streak of burning magnesium phosphorus tore through the blizzard, a crimson scream against the blue-black night. For a second, the red light revealed the true scale of the army marching down the glacier. Thousands of them. Then the cold took him. A shadow fell over him, and he looked up to see the massive figure looming, the runeblade descending not with anger, but with the inevitability of an executioner. The last thing Sergeant Varys felt was not pain, but a cold so absolute it burned like fire, and a whisper in his mind that sounded like the closing of a coffin lid. "Rise."
Varro Togurius, chief librarian of the Ultramarines, knelt within the sanctum of the Librarius, the air thick with the scent of burning heavy water and sacred unguents. Around him, the sigh-dampening fields hummed a low, thrumming bass note designed to shield the unaugmented from the raw power of the Empyrean. Togurius sought to cast his mind into the sea of souls, to read the currents of the warp for signs of the disturbance reported in the north. Usually, the warp was a cacophony, a screaming, roiling storm of emotions, demonic laughter, and the psychic echo of a trillion suffering souls. It was a place of fire and madness. But tonight, as he projected his astral form beyond the veil of reality, he found something far more terrifying than the laughter of dark gods. He found silence. It was not the peace of a vacuum, but the silence of a grave. The great ocean was not churning, it was stagnant. A vast, bruised purple stillness was spreading across the metaphysical cartography of Macragge, a blind spot in the warp that refused to reflect the light of the Astronomanicon. The librarian gasped, snapping back into his physical body with a violence that caused the lumens in the chamber to flicker and die. Frost, thick and unnatural, instantly coated the inside of his psychic hood. The temperature in the Librarius had plummeted 30 degrees in a single heartbeat. Togurius stood, his breath misting in the sudden chill. He had felt the shadow in the warp before, the hunger of the tyrannid hive mind that blocked out all psychic light. This was different. This was not a hunger that consumed, it was a cold that preserved. It felt like a dominant will, singular and despotic, asserting that death was the only true order. He looked to the corner of the sanctum where a cherub servitor, usually tasked with carrying data slates, hovered erratically. And as he watched, the anti-grav motor whined and failed. The biological components of the vat-grown construct flash-froze, turning the cherub into a macabre ice sculpture that shattered upon hitting the marble floor. The message was clear. The entity approaching them did not just kill life, it extinguished the spark that fueled the machine, the soul, and the warp alike. "Lord Tugurius," a Vox servitor intoned from the doorway, its voice distorted by the static interference that was now plaguing the entire hemisphere. "The chapter master requires your presence in the strategium. The northern grid is gone." Tugurius strode through the corridors of the Fortress of Hera, usually a bastion of warmth and martial pride. Now the condensation on the adamantium walls was freezing into intricate, jagged patterns that resembled runes he had never seen in the Codex Daemonica. Servitors were scrubbing the walls, but the ice returned seconds later, as if the fortress itself was perspiring fear. He reached the strategium, the nerve center of Ultramar. The mood was grim. Tactical officers huddled over logic engines that were spewing error codes. The great hololith table, which usually displayed the proud dominion of the 500 worlds, was dominated by a spreading stain of static and darkness engulfing the northern polar cap of Macragge. Marneus Calgar stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of stone, illuminated by the flickering blue light of the hololith. "Tugurius," Calgar's voice was a low rumble, grounded and calm despite the chaos. "The Auxilia garrisons at Omega 9 through 12 have ceased transmission. The last thermal scans indicated a drop to absolute zero. Is this Necron weaponry, a Gauss flux phenomenon?" Tugurius shook his head, the psychic frost still clinging to his armor. "No, Lord Calgar, the Necrons are soulless, but this is a soul so vast and terrible it mimics a god. It is necromancy, but not of the chaotic variety we know. It does not corrupt, it dominates. I felt a mind out there, Lord. It is calling to the dead of Macragge, and the dead are listening." The officers in the room went still. To suggest the honored dead of Ultramar could be turned against them was heresy of the highest order, yet the evidence on the screens, biosigns flatlining and then rising again with cold signatures, was irrefutable. Calgar looked at the hololith, watching the darkness creep toward the industrial hub of Magnus Civitas. His tactical acumen, honed over centuries of war, recognized the pattern immediately. It was an invasion force that grew larger with every soldier it killed. "We cannot wait for the theoretical to become the practical," Calgar stated, his hand resting on the sword of Ultramar. "If this enemy raises the dead, we must deny them the harvest." He turned to the Vox officer. "Mobilize the second company. Captain Sicarius is to make plantfall at Magnus Civitas immediately. His orders are absolute. Secure the population, or if they are compromised, purge the sector. We fight a plague, and the only cure is fire." Outside, the roar of Thunderhawk gunships spooling up their engines began to shake the foundations of the fortress, a sound of defiance against the silent, creeping cold that sought to swallow their world. Captain Cato Sicarius stood upon the boarding ramp of the Thunderhawk Talisarian Storm, the roar of its engines drowned out by the screams rising from the city below. Magna Civitas, a sprawling industrial hive that usually hummed with the pious industry of the emperor's loyal subjects, was burning. But it was not the clean, purging fire of an invasion. It was the chaotic, desperate fires of riots and madness.
The second company had deployed expecting a Xenos incursion, a defensive line to be held against a tangible foe. Instead, the Auspex scans were bleeding confusion. There were no drop pods, no bioships in orbit. The enemy was already inside. Sicarius adjusted the grip on his Talisarian Tempest blade, his auto-senses filtering the smog and ash. The reports were fragmentary but damning. The grain barges arriving from the northern agri-sectors had been tainted, not with poison, but with a sorcerous blight. The populace had eaten, and now the populace was dying. But they were not staying dead. As Sicarius descended onto the Grand Plaza, he saw the horror firsthand. A crowd of thousands, civilians of Ultramar, pressing against the cordon lines of the Arbites. They were not fleeing, they were hunting. The transition from citizen to monster was terrifiedly rapid, defying the biological laws known to the apothecaries. Sicarius watched a woman, clutching a child, fall to her knees as a gray pallor swept over her skin like a fast-moving cloud shadow. She convulsed, her spine arching with a sickening crack, and when she looked up, the humanity was gone. Her eyes burned with that same hateful electric blue that Tujurius had warned of. She tore into the throat of the man beside her with the savage strength of an orc. The infection was exponential. Every bite, every scratch spread the necrotic curse instantly. The Arbites' line collapsed, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of ghouls that had been their neighbors moments ago. "Captain," Sergeant Scipio's voice crackled over the vox, heavy with a rare hesitation. "The cogitators estimate total infection of the primary Habspire within the hour. The quarantine has failed. They are all lost, brother." Sicarius looked at the sprawling city, home to 3 million souls. The Codex Astartes preached duty, it preached protection, but it also preached that the mutant and the heretic must be purged to save the whole. Sicarius activated the external vox amplifiers of his armor, his voice booming like a god of war across the burning plaza. "This city has been claimed by the Shadow. There is no cure. There is only the Emperor's peace." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. To fail to protect Ultramar was a stain on his honor, but to allow this plague to spread would be the end of the 500 worlds. He made the calculation, the cold, brutal arithmetic of the Adeptus Astartes. "Second company," he commanded, his tone turning to steel, "engage. Purge the infected. Leave nothing standing." The hesitation in his brothers was palpable, a microsecond of delay as the transhuman warriors processed the order to slaughter the very people they were sworn to shield. Then discipline took over. The heavy bolters of the Devastator squad spun up. The flamers of the aggressors roared to life. Sicarius stepped forward, swinging his Tempest blade in a wide arc, decapitating a lunging ghoul. "Forgive us," he whispered into the sealed environment of his helm, "for we do what must be done." The massacre that followed was a scene from the darkest nightmares of the Age of Apostasy. The plaza became a slaughterhouse. Bolter rounds, mass reactive and explosive, tore through the densely packed crowds of the undead, reducing bodies to red mist and shattered bone. The smell of ozone, burning promethium, and cooked meat overwhelmed the senses. The Risen fought with no regard for self-preservation, throwing themselves onto chainswords to allow those behind them to claw at the Space Marines' armor. Sicarius fought in the center of the storm, a blur of blue and gold. He severed limbs, crushed skulls, and drove his blade through chest after chest. But for every 100 he killed, 1,000 more poured from the hab blocks. And they were evolving. Some of the dead were not mindless. They wielded improvised weapons, flanking the Astartes with tactical coordination that mocked the discipline of the Imperial Guard. A bolt shell struck Sicarius's pauldron, staggering him. He looked up, expecting a traitor Marine. Instead, he saw an Arbites Enforcer, dead and frozen, firing a shotgun with perfect, malicious accuracy. Then the temperature plummeted, freezing the blood that slicked the cobblestones. The fires of the burning buildings dwindled, suffocated by an unnatural vacuum. At the far end of the Avenue of Heroes, the smoke parted. Arthas Menethil walked through the inferno, the flames licking at his cloak but failing to burn it. He did not run, he strode with the terrifying patience of a glacier. He stopped before the body of Brother Altarion, a veteran sergeant who had fallen moments prior, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the ghouls. Sicarius roared a challenge, revving his plasma pistol to maximum charge. "Abomination! Face me!" Arthas ignored him. The Lich King extended Frostmourne, the runeblade hovering inches above the fallen Space Marine. Dark violet energy flowed from the sword into the ceramic armor. Brother Altarion twitched. The servos in his armor whined as he rose, but the purity seals on his chest blackened and curled away. The helmet lenses, once glowing loyalist red, flickered and ignited with the icy blue of the Scourge. She tore into the throat of the man beside her with the savage strength of an orc. The infection was exponential. Every bite, every scratch spread the necrotic curse instantly. The Lich King had not just come to kill them, he had come to recruit them.
Magos biologist Xylo Theta adjusted the focal aperture of his mechadendrite, peering through the 3-meter-thick layered plasteel and reinforced cryoglass of the observation deck. Station Pythias was not built to look out at the stars, but down into the ice. Deep beneath the glacial shelf of Macragge lay the frozen, preserved corpses of the First Tyrannic War, biological nightmares left behind by Hive Fleet Behemoth centuries ago. They were kept here for study, suspended in a state of absolute zero, specimens of the Great Devourer trapped in time. Usually, the data streams scrolling across Xylo Theta's retinal display were a comforting cascade of green binary, indicating total stasis. Today, they were bleeding red warnings. The ambient temperature of the containment vault, already designed to be inhospitable to life, was dropping further. It was an impossible anomaly. The cryocoils were operating at standard efficiency, yet the thermal Auspex registered an encroaching cold that felt structured. It was not an environmental shift, it was an intrusion. Deep in the gloom of the ice tomb, where the shadow of a dominatrix-class biotitan lay dormant, a light began to pulse. Not the bioluminescent green of the Tyranids, but a piercing, baleful azure. The vibration began in the floor plating, shaking the sacred oils from the altar of the Omnisia. Down in the vault, the ice was singing, a high-pitched groan of stress fractures migrating through the glacier. Xylo Theta signaled the Skitarii Praetorians to defensive positions, his logic cores spinning to calculate a probability model for spontaneous reanimation. The probability should have been 0. The specimens were dead. Their synaptic links to the hive mind were severed. Yet, as he watched, the massive frozen carapace of a Carnifex shuddered. The frost that encased it did not melt. Instead, it seemed to be absorbed into the creature's chitin, knitting together ravaged flesh with bonds of dark sorcery. The beast did not scream with the hunger of the hive mind. It rose in silence. The silence was the worst variable. Tyranids chittered, hissed, and roared. This creature pulled itself free from the glacial wall with a mechanical, silent determination, its movements jerky and puppeteered. Xylo Theta realized with a surge of terror in his organic brain, this was no longer a biological organism, it was a construct of bone and meat, driven by a code he could not decrypt. "Containment breach in sectors 1 through 9, the automated warning voice droned, instantly drowned out by the sound of tearing metal. The vault doors buckled inwards.
The Skitarii opened fire, their radium carbines and galvanic rifles lighting up the dark with radioactive fury. The shots struck the advancing wave of undead gaunts, blowing chunks of frozen meat from their frames, but the creatures did not slow. Pain was a biological feedback mechanism. These things had none. A Hormigaunt, missing its lower jaw and half its torso, leaped with impossible grace, its scythen talons shearing through the heavy ceramite of a Skitarii ranger. Xylotheta watched the slaughter with detached horror. The efficiency of the Tyranids had always been their adaptability, but this was brute force amplified by necromancy. The Frost Tyranids were harder, their carapaces reinforced by supernatural ice that deflected laze fire like void shields. They were not eating the fallen Skitarii to reclaim biomass, they were simply butchering them to clear the path. The floor of the observation deck erupted upwards. Debris and plasteel rained down as a massive shape tore its way up from the vault below. It was the Bio-Titan. The Hierophant, a god beast of the Tyranid race, had risen. Its massive biocannons were clogged with ice, but it did not need them. It swung a massive bladed limb, sweeping the entire tactical cogitator array and the tech priests manning it into a smear of oil and gore against the far wall. Xylotheta stumbled back, his servo arm grasping for purchase. The beast loomed over him, filling the entire chamber. Its eyes, once dead black orbs, were now burning pits of blue fire. It exhaled, not a spore cloud, but a cone of freezing breath that instantly solidified the remaining Skitarii defenders into statues of gray ash. The station was lost. The great devourer had been given a new master. The hive mind demanded flesh, but the Lich King demanded only service. Xylotheta attempted to purge his memory banks, to upload the data of this new threat to the noosphere before his destruction, but his connection was severed. A figure drifted up through the hole created by the Titan. It was not a Tyranid. It was a human, or what used to be one, robed in the tattered vestments of a cultist, floating on a disk of woven frost. A necromancer. The figure pointed a withered finger at the Magos. Xylotheta felt his bionics seize. The motive force in his power pack froze solid. He could feel the cold invading his interface ports, rewriting the binary code of his existence. He tried to recite the litany of protection, but his vocal emitter produced only static. "Your steel is strong, but iron bends to the will of the king," whispered the necromancer, the voice echoing inside Xylotheta's skull. As the darkness took him, the Magos did not die. He felt his loyalty shift, a seamless transition from the machine god to the lord of the Scourge. His optic lenses flickered, cycled down, and reignited. They were no longer red.
The engine deck of the Land Raider Pride of Hera vibrated with the fury of a caged god, the massive twin-linked heavy bolters thundering a staccato rhythm that reverberated through the hull. Brother Sergeant Karras, hardwired into the command throne, viewed the battlefield not with eyes of flesh, but through the multispectral logic of the tank's machine spirit. The plains before the Fortress of Hera, once a golden expanse of wheat and parade grounds, had been transformed into a frozen hellscape of churned mud and shattered ice. The second armored spearhead was advancing in a wedge formation, a wall of adamantium and ceramite designed to break the spine of any foe. Predators, Vindicators, and the mighty Land Raiders churned the permafrost beneath their treads, their exhausts spitting thick plumes of black smoke into the pristine, unnatural white of the blizzard. But the enemy they met was not a disorganized rabble. Out of the swirling snow rolled the siege engines of the damned, grotesque, bone-knit contraptions known in the dark legends of this new enemy as meat wagons.
They did not fire shells, they flung pressurized clots of diseased gore and necrotic slurry, a bombardment of biological filth that sizzled against the void shields of the Imperial tanks like acid. "Target solution locked. Main cannon, fire," Karras commanded. His fought impulse link translated the will to kill into binary execution. The Godhammer lass cannons mounted on the Pride of Hera's sponsons shrieked, sending lances of coherent light across the battlefield. 2 of the meat wagons vanished in expanding spheres of superheated plasma, their bone frames vaporizing instantly. Yet the victory was hollow. Karras watched on his tactical display as the ground itself began to betray them. The tactical cogitors screamed warnings of seismic anomalies directly beneath the armored column. "All units, brace! Subterranean breach!" he broadcasted, but it was too late for the Predator tank Valor's Edge on his starboard flank. The earth erupted in a geyser of rock and ice as a massive crypt lord, a beetle-like monstrosity of chitin and ancient bandage, burst from the ground. It was the size of a dreadnought, and with terrifying speed it rammed its spiked carapace into the underside of the Predator, flipping the 60-ton war machine onto its back like a helpless turtle. Smaller crypt fiends poured from the tunnel, their mandibles snapping steel cables and tearing at the exposed treads of the tanks, immobilizing them for the slaughter. The chaos of the melee was absolute. The armored discipline of the Ultramarines was unraveling against an enemy that attacked from above, below, and within. Karras felt the Pride of Hera shudder as a massive abomination, a stitching together of ogre and tyrannid musculature, slammed a meat hook as large as an anchor against the assault ramp. The machine spirit of the tank growled in his mind, a feral mix of anger and pain. But the true threat was not the brutes battering at the hull. It was the cold. The internal temperature of the tank was dropping rapidly. Rune displays frosted over. The hydraulic fluids in the autoloaders were beginning to thicken into sludge. "Tech Marine," Karras barked over the internal vox. "Why is the reactor output falling? We are losing motive power." The reply was a static-filled gasp. "It is the air outside, brother. The ambient temperature has dropped to levels that defy physics. The heat sinks are freezing over. The machine spirit is going into hibernation to survive." The tank was dying, not from damage, but from the sheer presence of the enemy commander. Then the sky tore open. The Auspex arrays went blind as a shadow eclipsed the pale sun. High above the battlefield, circling like a vulture of the apocalypse, was a creature of skeletal majesty, a frostworm. It was a dragon stripped of flesh, its bones glowing with the same pulsating blue witchlight that animated the eyes of the dead. It opened its maw, and the sound that emerged was not a roar, but the shrieking of 1,000 souls trapped in a glacier. It descended upon the lead vindicator, Hammer of Macragge. Karras watched in impotent horror as the worm unleashed its breath weapon. It was not fire, it was a concentrated beam of absolute stasis, a magical frost so potent it halted molecular motion instantly. The Vindicator did not explode, it simply stopped. The engine roar was cut off. The exhaust smoke froze in mid-air, falling as gray dust. The tank turned a ghostly, translucent blue, encased in a tomb of magical ice in the span of a heartbeat. "By the throne!" Karras whispered. The Vindicator, now a frozen monolith, was struck by a stray bolt shell. Under normal circumstances, the shell would have ricocheted off the sloped armor. Instead, the entire tank shattered. The ceramite, the plastisteel, the crew inside, everything, had been rendered as brittle as stained glass. The mighty siege tank disintegrated into a million glittering shards of frozen metal and flesh, collapsing into a heap of sparkling ruin. The invulnerability of the Adeptus Astartes armor was a lie against this sorcery. The frostworm banked, its empty eye sockets turning toward the Pride of Hera. Karras felt the chill seeping into his own interface ports, slowing his heart. "Reverse thrust!" he roared, overriding the safety limiters. "All units, fall back to the secondary line. Fall back to the fortress. We cannot fight the winter itself." The mighty armored spearhead of the Ultramarines, the hammer of the Emperor, broke formation and fled, chased by the howling winds and the laughter of a king who ruled the cold. The altimeter on the console of the Vengeance of Kauth screamed a proximity warning as Brother Pilot Actaeon pulled the stick back, forcing the Stormcallan into a vertical climb that would have liquefied the organs of a mortal man. Through the reinforced armaglass of the cockpit, the sky above Macragge was no longer the serene azure of Ultramar. It was a swirling vortex of slate-gray clouds and bruised purple lightning. Below him, the Fortress of Hera, the impregnable mountain fastness of the chapter, looked like a lone island of stone drowning in a sea of moving death. Actaeon's mission was air superiority, to clear the skies for the Thunderhawks evacuating the wounded from the outer defensive lines. But the skies were thick with abominations. The clouds themselves seemed to pulse with a malevolent intelligence, birthing horrors that defied aerodynamic logic. He banked hard to starboard, his twin-linked assault cannons spinning up with a mechanical whine that vibrated through his gauntlets. "Gold leader to wing," he voxed, the static of the storm chewing on his words. "Engage at will. Keep the ceiling high. Do not let them drag you into the storm." The enemy air force descended not in wings or squadrons, but in swarms. They were a hideous amalgamation of Xenos biology and necrotic sorcery. Tyrannid gargoyles, their leather wings tattered and rotting, flew alongside the skeletal forms of reanimated pterodons. But the true lords of this frozen sky were the frostworms. Actaeon watched as one of the draconic skeletons tore through the cloud layer, its ribs glowing with the witchlight of the Lich King. It collided with Brother Valerius's Stormhawk interceptor, not firing a weapon, but simply smashing into it with the mass of an avalanche. The interception was brutal and primitive. The worm's claws, harder than diamond, sheared through the ceramite fuselage like parchment. Valerius didn't even have time to eject before his craft was crushed, spiraling down into the burning city below as a twisted wreck of metal and bone. Actaeon squeezed his firing stud, unleashing a torrent of high-explosive bolts at a flock of gargoyles. The rounds detonated against their frozen carapaces, showering the air with shards of ice and black ichor. But for every beast he swatted from the sky, 3 more took its place. "Targeting logic failure," the machine spirit of the gunship intoned, a rare note of panic in its synthetic voice. Actaeon cursed, toggling the sensor filters. The Stormtalon's Skyhammer missiles relied on thermal signatures to lock onto their prey, the heat of an engine, the biological warmth of a muscle. But these enemies were dead. They possessed no heat signature. They were colder than the void itself. To the targeting computer, the sky was empty, even as Actaeon stared directly at a wall of screeching monsters. "Switching to manual optics," he growled, overriding the cogitator. He was flying blind, relying on his transhuman reflexes and the naked eye. He lined up a frostworm in his reticle, leading the target by a fraction of a second, and fired his missiles dumbfire. The warheads shrieked through the freezing air, striking the worm in its exposed ribcage. The explosion was muted, the fireball instantly snuffing out in the unnatural cold, but the kinetic force shattered the creature's spine. It fell, tumbling silently into the clouds, but Actaeon felt no triumph. His instrument panel was frosting over from the inside. The storm suddenly shifted. The swirling clouds ceased their chaotic motion and began to rotate around a singular point directly above the fortress, a massive spiraling eye of the storm. From the center of this vortex, a pillar of absolute cold descended. It was a sorcerous blizzard summoned by the master of the Scourge to ground the Imperial flyers. Actaeon felt the vengeance of Kauth lurch violently as the air density changed instantly. The wind shear was catastrophic. Ice began to form on the wings,
inches thick in a matter of seconds, destroying the lift surfaces. The engines choked, the intake fans screaming as they tried to digest air that had turned to solid crystals. "Mayday! Mayday!" The Voxnet was a chorus of dying screams as the entire squadron was swatted from the sky by the hand of winter. The controls froze solid in Actaeon's grip. The HUD flickered and died. Gravity reclaimed its dominion. The gunship stalled, nosediving toward the courtyard of the Fortress of Hera, a falling stone wrapped in a coffin of ice. The impact was a thunderclap that rattled Actaeon's teeth in his skull. The grav couch absorbers and the reinforced cockpit saved his life, but the vengeance of Calth was a ruin, skidding across the marble flagstones of the inner courtyard before smashing into a statue of Roboute Guilliman. Actaeon blew the explosive bolts on the canopy, the glass shattering outward, and scrambled from the wreckage, his bolter drawn. He fell to the ground, gasping the freezing air. He looked up, expecting to see the sky he had just fallen from. Instead, his gaze was drawn to the immense outer walls of the fortress. What he saw stopped his hearts. The undead were not just sieging the walls, they were becoming the walls. Millions of bodies, cultists, tyrannids, animals, fallen brothers, were piling up onto one another, a whirling, climbing mountain of death. They trampled each other to create a ramp of flesh, rising higher and higher, cresting the battlements like a rising tide. The sky belonged to the worms, and the earth belonged to the dead. The Fortress of Hera was alone. Marneus Calgar stood at the threshold of the Eternity Gate, a monolith of blue ceramite and defiance against a horizon that had ceased to exist. Where once there were the rolling hills of Macragge, there was now only a gray, writhing ocean of the dead. The gauntlets of Ultramar, ancient relics of the chapter, were hot to the touch, their built-in bolters spitting mass-reactive death until the barrels glowed cherry red. But for every 100 bodies Calgar pulverized, for every traitor Astartes he swatted aside like a gnat, the tide merely rose higher. The air was thick with the cloying stench of chemicals and ancient dust, the smell of a tomb opened after millennia. Beside him, the Victrix Guard fought with the synchronized perfection of clockwork, their power shields locking together to form a wall of shimmering energy. Yet Calgar could feel the fatigue settling into his transhuman muscles. It was not physical exhaustion. Space Marines were bred to fight for weeks without rest. It was a spiritual heaviness. The enemy weaponized despair. The cold that radiated from the horde slowed the heart and whispered that resistance was a folly of the living. The ground shook with a tremor that cracked the marble flagstones of the courtyard. The horde parted, not out of fear, but out of obedience. From the mass of ghouls emerged a monstrosity of chitin and bandage, a crypt lord of immense proportions. It stood taller than a Redemptor dreadnought, its spiked carapace glistening with frost, flanked by swarms of scuttling carrion beetles. This was Anubarak, the traitor king of the Nerubians, raised to serve the Scourge. It charged, a blur of motion too fast for something of its size. Calgar stepped forward to meet it, roaring the catechism of hate. The Crypt Lord's massive claw swept down, shattering the energy shield of a Victrix Guard and impaling the veteran Astartes on a spike of bone. Calgar didn't hesitate. He engaged the beast, the gauntlets of Ultramar hammering against the creature's thick armor with the force of artillery shells. Chitin cracked and oozed blue ichor. The Crypt Lord screeched, a sound of tectonic grinding, and unleashed a swarm of locusts from its thorax that chewed through ceramite seals. Calgar ignored the biting insects, stepping inside the monster's reach to deliver a devastating uppercut that caved in its insectoid skull. As the beast fell, a silence, louder than the battle, descended upon Calgar's mind. It was a psychic intrusion, bypassing his mental fortresses with the ease of a key turning in a lock. "Do you feel it, Marneus?"
The voice was deep, regal, and terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of Arthas. "Your emperor sits upon a throne of gold, rotting in silence. I sit upon a throne of ice, and my subjects are eternal. Why do you fight for a corpse that cannot speak when you could serve a king who calls your name?" Calgar gritted his teeth, the psychic pressure causing blood to run from his nose. Around him he saw his brothers falter. A sergeant of the 1st Company lowered his bolter for a fraction of a second, his eyes glazing over as the whisper took hold. "Courage and honor," Calgar bellowed, his voice amplified by his armor's voxcasters, shattering the psychic trance. "We do not serve the dead. We are the angels of death." The declaration was a physical blow against the darkness, rallying his men. But Calgar felt the truth in his marrow. They were holding the line, but they were losing the war of the soul. The tactical situation devolved into a nightmare of logistics. The Scourge had abandoned all pretense of strategy for sheer biological mass. They began to pile up against the adamantium walls of the fortress, corpse upon corpse, a pyramid of flesh built from the bodies of the fallen. They climbed over each other with frenzied desperation, a ladder of dead that rose 10, 20, 30 meters high. Tyrannid gaunts used human bodies as stepping stones. Death Knights drove their mounts up the slope of gore. They were cresting the battlements. The automated tarantula turrets ran dry, their barrels melting from sustained fire. Calgar watched as a wave of ghouls spilled over the parapets, dragging a chaplain down into the seething mass. There was no room for tactics anymore. It was a brawl in a telephone booth, a grinding attrition where the enemy had infinite reinforcements and the Ultramarines had nowhere left to retreat. The concept of theoretical and practical vanished. There was only survival. A flash of runic steel caught Calgar's eye. A Death Knight, formerly Captain Titus of the 4th Company, now a vessel of cold malice, lunged through the breach. He wielded a power sword corrupted by frost magic. Calgar parried, but the Death Knight was fast, fueled by the unnatural vigor of the Lich King. The corrupted blade slipped past Calgar's guard, finding the gap in the artificer armor at his waist. The blade bit deep. It was not a mortal wound for a Primarch Marine, but the effect was immediate. The cold spread from the wound instantly, freezing his secondary heart. He stumbled, dropping to one knee, his vision graying. The infection of the Scourge was in his blood now. He smashed the Death Knight aside with a backhand blow, but the damage was done. He looked up at the Sanctum of the Primarch behind him. The defenses were broken. The enemy was inside. He could not hold them back alone. "Father," Calgar whispered, his voice trembling with the chill that was seizing his lungs. "Theoretical, we are lost. Practical, wake up."
Deep within the inviolate command sanctum of the Fortress of Hera, Roboute Guilliman stood before the ominous hololith, his face a mask of marble stoicism that belied the furiously processing transhuman intellect behind his eyes. The data streams cascading around him were a litany of catastrophe. The 1st Company was broken. The outer walls were breached in 19 distinct sectors. The psychic scream of the enemy was dampening the morale of even the most hardened veterans. Guilliman did not feel fear. He felt the cold, hard weight of calculation. He ran the strategic simulations, the theoreticals, 1,000 times in the span of a single heartbeat. Theoretical. The enemy possesses infinite reinforcements and a leader capable of subverting the laws of death. Practical. Conventional attrition warfare will result in the total consumption of Macragge within 43 standard minutes. He watched a feed from the gate where Calgar, his greatest son, fell to one knee, ice creeping up his armor. The logistics of the battle had shifted from a military engagement to a spiritual execution. The pen could no longer save Ultramar. It was time for the sword. Guilliman turned from the tactical display, his movements fluid and heavy with purpose.
The armor of fate, a masterpiece of artifice that kept his life force bound to his body, hummed with a low, aggressive resonance as if sensing the violence to come. He reached out and grasped the hilt of the Emperor's sword. The moment his ceramite gauntlet touched the leather grip, the chamber was bathed in a blinding golden incandescence. The blade did not just ignite, it roared. Flames of psychic purity, fed by the agonizing will of the master of mankind, erupted along the length of the weapon. The shadows in the room, shadows that had been deepening as the Lich King's influence permeated the fortress, were instantly incinerated. This was the anathema. It was the one variable Arthas Menethil had not accounted for, a weapon that did not merely kill the body, but obliterated the very essence of the soul. Guilliman felt the Emperor's presence in the back of his mind, a distant, burning star of rage. "They have broken the laws of existence," Guilliman spoke to the empty room, his voice vibrating with the power of a demigod. "I shall correct them." The blast doors of the inner sanctum, sealed since the siege began, groaned as the maglocks disengaged. They began to open, grinding slowly, but before they could fully retract, Guilliman kicked them. The adamantium gates, thick enough to withstand orbital bombardment, flew off their hinges, tumbling out into the courtyard like discarded toys. The battlefield fell silent. The howling wind of the blizzard died instantly. From the darkness of the sanctum, a light emerged, not the cold blue of the Scourge, but a searing, defiant gold. Guilliman leapt from the balcony, a 20-meter drop that would have shattered a tank. He landed amidst the horde surrounding the fallen Calgar, the impact creating a shockwave that pulverized the stone floor and sent hundreds of undead flying. He did not fight, he conducted a symphony of destruction. The Emperor's sword became a blur of sunlight. He severed the heads of crypt fiends, bisected abominations, and smashed through ranks of death knights with contemptuous ease. Every swing of the sword left a trail of golden fire that lingered in the air, a barrier the undead could not cross. He reached Calgar, who looked up through cracked lenses. "Lord," Calgar rasped, shame coloring his voice, "we failed." Guilliman hauled the chaptermaster to his feet with one hand, parrying a blow from a massive flesh golem with the other. "You endured, Marneus," Guilliman stated, his voice booming across the courtyard, amplified by the vox grills of the fortress. "You bought time, and time is the one weapon I needed. Rally the victress, form up on me, we march to the ridge." The Primarch turned his gaze toward the northern ridge, locking eyes with the figure standing amidst the storm. Across the sea of churning bodies, Roboute Guilliman and Arthas Menethil regarded one another. It was a meeting of dark mirrors, the king of the dead against the lord of the living, the master of cold against the bearer of fire. The undead army, sensing the threat, surged forward in a frenzy, a tsunami of bones and rusted steel trying to drown the light. Guilliman advanced. He did not run, he walked with the unstoppable momentum of history itself. With every step, the Emperor's sword blazed brighter, acting as a beacon in the warp. The despair that had gripped the Ultramarines shattered, replaced by a religious fervor. They were no longer fighting for survival, they were fighting alongside a god. Guilliman raised the burning sword high, pointing it directly at the Lich King. "Your theft of life ends now," he projected, his voice cutting through the psychic scream of the storm. "Face me, ghost, or be exorcised."
The battlefield, a churning cauldron of noise and slaughter, fell into a terrified silence as the two titans closed the distance. It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath, pausing the war to witness a conflict of higher orders. On one side, Roboute Guilliman, the Avenging Son, a being of biological perfection and golden reason, moving with the terrifying velocity of a thunderbolt. On the other, Arthas Menethil, the Lich King, a nexus of death and sorrow, drifting forward like the inevitable creep of a glacier. They met in the center of the ridge, the impact of their collision generating a shockwave that flattened the surrounding ruins. Frostmourne, the runeblade that had drunk the souls of a kingdom, clashed against the Emperor's sword, the blade that burned with the psychic wrath of the master of mankind. The sound was not of metal on metal, but of two realities rejecting one another. A sphere of energy, half freezing void, half searing holy fire, erupted from the point of impact, vaporizing the snow and exposing the bedrock of Macragge for the first time in days. The duel that followed was a blur of motion too fast for the naked eye to track. Guilliman fought with the calculated precision of a cogitator, every strike a theoretical theorem turned into a practical execution. He battered Arthas's defenses, his sword leaving trails of golden fire that hung in the air like caged suns. But the Lich King was not a warrior of flesh and blood, he was an avatar of endurance. Guilliman landed a blow that would have bisected a Terminator, shearing through the serenite plate of Arthas's shoulder. There was no blood, only a hiss of escaping grave gas. Arthas did not flinch. Instead, he countered with a backhand swing that caught Guilliman in the chest. The armor of fate, a masterpiece of Belisarius' call, groaned under the stress. Frostmourne bit deep into the ceramite, and for the first time in millennia, the Primarch felt the cold touch of true death. The wound did not bleed red, it frosted over instantly, the necrotic magic trying to travel up his veins to stop his hearts. "You fight for a failing dream," Arthas intoned, his voice a chorus of 1,000 dead souls echoing inside Guilliman's helm. The Lich King raised his left hand, and the blizzard responded. Screaming spirits, banshees, and specters swirled around the Primarch, tearing at his mind, showing him visions of the Imperium in flames, of his father's corpse rotting on the golden throne. It was a psychic assault designed to break the will. But Arthas had miscalculated. He sought to exploit despair, but he was facing the Lord of Ultramar. Guilliman's eyes blazed with a cold, hard fury. The psychic fire of the Emperor's sword flared, turning white-hot. "I do not dream," Guilliman roared, the fire purging the ghosts from the air, incinerating them into nothingness. "I plan, and you are an error in my logistics." He drove his knee into Arthas's midsection, buckling the king's plate, and followed with a pommel strike that cracked the Lich King's jaw. Arthas stumbled back, realigning his stance. The arrogance in his posture began to crack. He raised Frostmourne high, and the blade began to keen, a high-pitched wail that shattered the lenses of distant helmets. He prepared a strike of total annihilation, channeling the entirety of the Frozen Throne's power into a single blow. Guilliman analyzed the stance in a picosecond. Theoretical. He overcommits to the strike, relying on the terror of the weapon to freeze the opponent. Practical. Intercept the weapon, not the wielder. As Arthas swung the runeblade down, seeking to cleave the Primarch in two, Guilliman stepped into the guard. He caught the flat of Frostmourne on his gauntlet, the force cracking his wrist bones, but he held it fast. The two blades were locked. The Emperor's sword burned against the dark ice of Frostmourne. The runeblade, forged by the Nathrezim, had claimed millions of mortal souls, but it could not digest the psychic anathema of the Emperor. Spiderweb cracks appeared along the runes. "There is no king who rules forever," Guilliman whispered, echoing the prophecy that haunted Arthas. With a roar of exertion that shook the mountains, the Primarch twisted his blade, shattering Frostmourne into 1,000 shards of crying metal. The explosion of released souls knocked both warriors back, but Guilliman recovered first.
Arthas stood stunned, looking at the broken hilt in his hand, the spirits he had enslaved swirling free into the warp. He looked up, his eyes widening as he saw the golden blade descending. Guilliman did not aim for the heart, he aimed for the crown. The Emperor's sword struck the helm of domination, the ancient artifact, the prison of the Ner'zhul and the anchor of the Scourge, split down the middle. A pillar of dark energy geysered into the sky, piercing the storm clouds. The blue light in Arthas's eyes flickered, dimmed, and then, for the first time since he took up the sword, the man beneath the monster gasped for air.
The silence that followed the shattering of the helm was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of a puppet whose strings had been cut. The pillar of necrotic energy that erupted from the broken crown dissipated into the atmosphere, taking with it the unnatural storm that had choked Macragge. Across the ridge, and indeed across the entire northern polar cap, the coordinated intelligence of the Scourge evaporated in an instant. The risen did not all fall, the mindless dead simply collapsed like marionettes, returning to the inertia of death, while the more complex horrors, the crypt lords and the abominations, went feral. Without the dominating will of the Lich King to command them, they turned on each other or stood catatonic, their dark purpose severed. Roboute Guilliman lowered the Emperor's sword, the flames along its blade dimming to a smoldering ember. He stood over the broken form of Arthas Menethil. The armor of the king was rent asunder, the dark magic bleeding out into the snow like black oil. Arthas lay upon his back, the blue witchlight in his eyes fading to a dull human gray. For a fleeting moment, the monster was gone, replaced by the prince who had fallen so far. He looked up at the towering Primarch, his lips moving. "Father," he rasped, a sound like dry leaves skittering on stone. "Is it over?" Guilliman looked down, his face a mask of sorrowful judgment. He saw the tragedy of the creature, a man who sought to save his people and destroyed them in the process. It was a grim reflection of the Horus heresy, a reminder that the road to damnation is paved with noble intent. "The nightmare is ended," Guilliman answered, his voice low. He did not offer forgiveness, the 41st millennium had no place for it. He simply offered the end. With a precise, merciful thrust, he drove the tip of the Emperor's sword through the fallen prince's heart, severing the last tether to the mortal coil. Arthas Menethil exhaled one final time, and his body crumbled, dissolving into ash and ice, leaving only the shattered armor behind. The days that followed were a blur of grim industry. The cleanup, as the logisticians called it, was a war in itself. The dead of Macragge could not be buried. The soil was too tainted by the necromantic residue. They had to be burned. Massive pyres, fueled by promethium and blessed by the chaplains, burned day and night across the northern plains. The smoke rose in thick, greasy columns, blackening the sky. Guilliman stood on the battlements of the Fortress of Hera, watching the fires. He could smell it, the scent of his own people, his own sons being returned to ash. It was a Pyrrhic victory. The frozen scar, a miles-wide patch of land where the grass would never grow again, marred the surface of his home world. It was a wound in the biosphere that terraforming engines would take centuries to heal, but the deeper wound was in the morale of the chapter. He visited the Apothecarian, where Marneus Calgar lay in healing trance. The chapter master would survive, but the frost scars on his soul would remain. The Ultramarines were warriors of logic and discipline, but they had been forced to slaughter their own brothers who had risen against them. They had looked into the eyes of dead comrades and seen a cold intelligence looking back.
Reports were coming in from the chaplains of a new malaise affecting the Second Company, a survivor's guilt, magnified by the horror of the undead. Guilliman realized that the Lich King's weapon was not just the sword, but the memory. He had shown them that even in death there is no duty ended, only slavery. "Record this," Guilliman spoke to the autoquill hovering by his shoulder. "Theoretical, the enemy is destroyed. Practical, the enemy has proven that our biological supremacy is fragile. We must invest in new psychic shielding protocols. We must ensure that when an Astartes dies, he stays dead." Deep within the Omega Vaults, far beneath the Fortress of Hera, the final act of the war was concluded. 2 tech marines, clad in heavy radiation-shielded plate, lowered a stasis casket into a containment field. Inside lay the shards of Frostmourne and the fragments of the Helm of Domination. The artifact still whispered, a low, buzzing static that made the eyes water. Guilliman watched as the void shield snapped into place, locking the items away from reality for eternity. There would be no Lich King to replace the fallen one. There would be no jailer of the damned. The dead would simply be dead. Guilliman turned his back on the vault, the heavy adamantum blast doors sealing with a final resonant thud. The threat was contained, but the galaxy remained a dark and terrible place. As he walked back into the shadows of the fortress, the Primarch's hand rested on the hilt of his father's sword. The ice was gone, but the war never ends.